They are the most unnerving photographs you will ever see. At first glance, they promise the warm proof of a proud, bustling civilization. Broad avenues, marble facades, ornate balconies, statues frozen like watchful sentries. The cities in these pictures look immaculate, almost theatrical, streets swept as if by invisible hands, fountains arcing with perfect symmetry, grand buildings stretched along horizons with the precision of stage sets. And then you notice the absence. There are no faces, no carts, no laundry on balconies, no stacks of wood, no crates, no barrels, no horse harnesses. The windows are dark and empty, like blind sockets in a great stone skull. On the rooftops, 1,000 chimneys, not a single thread of smoke. No sign that anyone in those houses had lit a fire, cooked a meal, or warmed an evening room. It is the kind of silence that does not belong to a sleeping city. It belongs to a city that has been paused, washed, and arranged with painstaking care, as if life itself had been erased for the sake of the photograph. If this opening grabs you, do me a small favor now, hit like, and if you enjoy mysteries like this one, subscribe. There's more to come. Not because we're selling anything, but because these pictures demand to be looked at again and again. For decades, the easiest explanation given by historians and photographers has been the same. Early cameras were clumsy things. Plates were slow and exposure times long. People and animals moved, vanished into blurs. The machinery simply could not record them. That argument has merit. It explains many of the quirks of early photography. Some of the earliest images of streets do, in fact, erase motion. They leave behind only what stood still long enough to be fixed on silver and glass. Still, the photographs we're about to follow do not behave like many of those early pictures. They are not accidents of light. They are records of the world arranged and presented as if for inspection. Move through them with patience and the steady eye of an investigator, and other questions begin to form darker, more persistent questions than the one about exposure time. Where are the vendors who stand at their stalls for hours? Where are the carts tethered to posts? The dung of horses, the broken signs, the patchwork of household life that always cluttered the margins of city streets. Where are the ash heaps, the utility crates, the ropes and ladders, and the tireless clutter of daily survival? If exposure time erased motion, it did not erase stillness. Yet the stillness here is total and unnatural. We will set one truth at the center of this first part. Photographs are inventions of both light and intent. A picture tells two stories at once: what the lens captures, and why the photographer chose to point the lens in a particular way. In the images that haunt these pages, the composition is clinical, almost juridical. Wide, full-frame angles, empty sightlines, a focus on infrastructure, canals, bridges, facades, fountains, and the condition of drains and pavements. These seem less like the work of an artist than the work of an inspector. Taken together, the elements begin to outline another possibility. These are not cityscapes of daily life. They could be photographic reports. What kind of report? For whom might these clean, empty, battle-ready streets be posed? We are suspended between two simple but terrifying possibilities. The first, that we are looking at cities shortly after a catastrophe, places that were emptied and only later swept clean and repaired, prior to being declared habitable once more. The second, that something stranger, more deliberate, more systematic happened. A removal of life on a scale that makes the very idea of repopulation into a political act of monumental proportions. To make sense of either possibility, we have to step away from the streets and up into the sky. If streets are the body of a city, then climate is the pulse that keeps it beating. And in the early 19th century, the pulse of the Northern Hemisphere faltered. You may have heard the phrase, "the year without a summer." It refers to 1816, a year when unseasonable frost, relentless rain, and crop failures ravaged much of Europe and the Americas. The eruption of a single Indonesian volcano, Mount Tambora, in 1815, hurled enormous quantities of ash and sulfur into the upper atmosphere, creating a veil that dimmed sunlight across the world. Temperatures dropped, harvests failed, food prices soared, and desperate people protested in city squares. Scientists and historians now treat that year as a dramatic example of how a single climatic shock can cascade into famine, disease, and social upheaval. But a photograph does not prove a volcanic eruption caused empty streets. It offers a trace, a visual remnant, that must be read against other records: price books, ship logs, parish registers, local chronicles. When those mute paper trails are thin or vanish entirely, the photographs acquire a strange power. They become a stubborn counter-archive, images that suggest a story other documents do not tell. In many records from Western Europe and North America, the aftermath of Tambora is painfully visible. Crops failed. Flooding and frost made grain scarce. People moved, sometimes in panic, from the worst-hit regions toward less damaged lands. Famine bred unrest. Disease followed hunger. The historical consensus is clear that 1816 and the years immediately after were catastrophic for many, though uneven in geography and intensity. And yet when we look at the archive of photographs stretching across the capitals of Europe and beyond, there is a maddening inconsistency. For some regions, we have pages full of official documents and angry petitions. For others, we have near silence. Russia, with its vast fields and colder climate, is oddly underdocumented for this period in ways some scholars still puzzle over. Was there less trouble there? Or was the trouble so comprehensive that the institutions that record events, clerks, parish registrars, the printed press, were themselves victims of collapse? Or worse, were records deliberately removed and refashioned by later hands shaping a different future? We cannot answer these larger historical questions in a single breath. What we can do in this first part is follow the evidence where it leads. Look carefully at the images themselves and let them tell us what they will. The emptiness is not uniform. There are details that are too tidy, too deliberate, pavements repaired, windows full and intact, fountains operational, jets of water leaping into the air while the plazas below them stand empty. These images suggest a very particular moment, not the ruins a catastrophe leaves behind, but the cleaned, prepared husk that remains after reconstruction and before repopulation. Imagine a team of workmen who have swept away the detritus of hurried abandonment. Imagine masons and carpenters repairing facades, glaziers replacing panes, municipal workers flushing sewers and testing fountains. Imagine then a photographer summoned to record the result. The camera will find a city that appears whole but hollow, functional but lifeless. The photographs become a certificate. This place is fit to receive people again. They are, in short, documentation of readiness. But who would need such documentation? What political eye required visible proof that a city was ready? Who decided, and why, that whole populations should be removed and entire capitals prepared for future use? These are the questions that will propel us through the next chapters. For now, hold this image in your mind. A great city, marble, iron, and stone, posed for inspection. The fountains cry in the absence of an audience. The windows stare blankly. A single, almost invisible wisp of smoke might thread the sky above a single roof. It might be a watchman's hearth. It might explain nothing. It might be the last ember of life in a vast frozen place. In the chapters ahead, we will pursue that ember through archives, climate records, eyewitness fragments, and the architecture of silence itself. We will examine the plausibility of exposure-ruled explanations, trace the evidence for wide-scale environmental shock, and follow the inconvenient facts that photographs refuse to let us ignore. Forget, for a moment, the neat theories of long exposure or artistic intent. Just look. Each image is a portrait of perfection without pulse. Streets paved to geometric precision, facades rising like palaces of order and wealth. But stare long enough, and the perfection itself begins to decay before your eyes, because the more flawless the image, the more impossible it becomes. Cities are not perfect. Cities are alive, noisy, cluttered, unpredictable. They breathe. They scatter traces of themselves everywhere. Barrels waiting to be rolled away, horse droppings glistening on cobblestones, laundry flapping in a window breeze, the uneven rhythm of footsteps. And yet here, there is none of it. This is not the silence of dawn before the markets open. It is the silence of something that has ended. In the broad boulevards of Paris, not a single carriage waits for a fare. In Moscow, the alleys are swept clean, the doors shut, the stoves cold. In St. Petersburg, the fountains roar proudly, but not one curious onlooker stands nearby. It's as if every citizen has simply walked out of the frame. all of them, leaving behind only their architecture, their tools, their ghosts. And then there are the windows, the eyes of these sleeping giants. If you've ever walked through an abandoned building, you know the feeling. The air too still, the rooms too clean, as if someone tidied up before leaving forever. These photographs capture that same uncanny tidiness. The curtains are gone. No hint of life softens the angular lines of the panes. Even the balconies, the small bridges between the private and public world, are barren. No chairs, no flower pots, no scraps of cloth catching the sun. Nothing. If this was truly the world of the mid-19th century, where had its pulse gone? The official explanation has always been comforting in its simplicity. Early photographic technology was slow, painfully slow. Depending on the process, an exposure could take anywhere from several seconds to several minutes. People and animals that moved during that time would disappear like ghosts, their motion too quick to be trapped on the plate. Only what stood still, the stone, the iron, the glass, would remain. Convenient. Logical. But does it hold up? Let's test it against reality. Imagine for a moment the heart of any large city in that era, the morning market. Even if people are moving about, there are things that don't move. Vendors remain behind their counters, sometimes for hours. Their tables are piled with bread, vegetables, barrels of wine or oil. Their customers pause to chat or haggle. If the camera's exposure lasts a few minutes, some of these figures would have stayed still long enough to leave at least a ghostly blur. Yet there are none. No trace of humanity at all. Not even an outline. What about the transportation that made cities function? Horses are restless creatures. Yes, they shift, they stamp, they flick their tails, but they do not vanish. Carriages and wagons, when parked, are stationary masses of wood and iron. Even blurred, they would have registered on the plate as shapes or shadows. Instead, we see nothing but vast, open cobblestones and perfectly aligned rails without a single vehicle. Now turn your gaze upward to the rooftops, a sea of chimneys. In that age, every home relied on fire. There was no central heating, no gas pipelines, no electric stoves. The smoke rising from chimneys was as common as breath. Yet in these images, the skies are utterly clean. Not a wisp of smoke mars the horizon. You could argue it was summer when stoves lay dormant. But remember, these cities lay in cold northern climates. Even in July, kitchens still burned fires to cook food. The statistical chance of every hearth going cold at once across entire metropolises is effectively zero. The evidence builds not like an argument, but like a pressure. You can feel it rising behind the eyes. If the streets are too empty, the windows too dark, and the rooftops too cold, maybe we are not looking at a city caught in a moment. Maybe we are looking at one caught after the moment, a civilization in postscript. Could there have been a mass evacuation? A forced abandonment? Or was it something larger? Something that left every city on Earth gasping at the same time? Before we chase the larger theories, we must first confront the anomalies, those tiny cracks where reality seems to flicker. Because every mystery, no matter how overwhelming, leaves behind fragments of contradiction. In some photographs, barely visible if you squint, there's an open window, just one, its narrow frame tilted outward as if someone had leaned out to breathe. What could that mean? Was someone still inside? Or was the window left open in a hurry, a gesture of panic during flight? And in St. Petersburg, those grand fountains, they aren't frozen. They're working, water arcs high into the air, glimmering under the sunlight, cascading into granite basins. To make that happen, the city's plumbing system must have been active, the pumps running, the pressure maintained. Someone had to operate them. So who did? Were there engineers testing the waterworks for inspection? Were these not the fountains of daily life, but instruments in a rehearsal, a demonstration for unseen officials? And then there's the faintest trace in one photograph, a ghostly thread of smoke rising from a single chimney. If it's not a scratch on the plate, it could mean that someone still lived there. One house, one fire, one life burning quietly among millions of cold hearths. But a single breath of warmth doesn't bring a city back to life. It only proves how utterly dead the rest of it must be. Each of these details, The window, the fountains, the lone chimney invites hope, but also doubt. They could be signs of life, or they could be remnants of something far more unsettling, the aftercare of a corpse. An open window could mean the airing out of abandoned homes. Flowing fountains could mark a final test before closure. A wisp of smoke might belong to a watchman or a caretaker guarding an empty district. If that's true, then these cities were not alive but quiet. They were being prepared. Prepared for what? To answer that, we must learn to read the photographs as bureaucrats might have read them, not as art, but as inventory. Look closely at the framing of each shot. There's a methodical consistency, almost an administrative style. Streets photographed in sequence, facades lined in order, entire districts covered like a checklist. It looks less like creative curiosity and more like a government inspection. Each picture says, "We have restored this. It stands ready." Ready for what? Repopulation. It's a shocking idea at first, but the more you study the details, the more it begins to make sense. The absence of clutter, the cleanliness, the tested fountains, the repaired windows. Everything about these cities screams maintenance, not abandonment. These weren't ruins left to crumble. They were relics brought back to order. It's as if some authority, unseen, unmentioned, had carried out an immense operation of repair after something catastrophic. The kind of work you would do if your civilization had nearly ended and you were preparing to bring it back to life. But to repopulate a city, you first have to empty it. And that is where this story begins to blur the line between history and horror. What could possibly have emptied the largest cities of the world so completely, so uniformly, that even their animals were gone? What kind of event could erase millions, freeze fountains, extinguish fires, and still leave behind cities intact, untouched by war, but dead all the same? The answer may lie not in politics or architecture, but in the sky. Because around the same time these ghostly photographs appear, something else was happening. Something colossal, recorded in fragments and whispers. A darkness that fell across continents, a summer that never came, a cold that refused to end. In the next part, we'll travel beyond the city walls, to the frozen fields where the real story began, and where the pulse of the old world stopped beating. The year was 1816, and the world forgot what summer felt like. Across the northern hemisphere, spring never truly came. Snow fell in June, rivers froze in July, and fields that had once shimmered with golden wheat turned gray beneath a sky that never cleared. The sun was pale, weak, as though seen through smoke. People spoke of it as if it had been stolen, its warmth, its color, its mercy. They called it the year without a summer. Official history tells us it began with fire. Half a world away, on a volcanic island in Indonesia, a mountain called Tambora exploded with the fury of 100 million cannons. Its roar circled the planet, and its ash climbed so high into the sky that it joined the upper winds and stayed there. The fine dust spread across continents, forming a veil around the earth, a thin, ghostly shroud that dimmed the light of the sun. For months, the world burned. Then, it froze. The eruption killed tens of thousands nearby, but its true victims were far away, in lands that never saw the volcano itself. The ash in the atmosphere scattered sunlight, turning the skies copper and blood red. Crops withered under frost and relentless rain. Rivers swelled and swallowed villages. Even the birds flew in confused circles, unable to find their migratory paths. Europe became a continent of hunger. In France, people tore bark from trees to make flour. In Ireland, the potatoes rotted black in the ground. In Switzerland, starving peasants stormed storehouses. Horses, the great engines of empire, were slaughtered for meat. The price of grain rose tenfold. Corpses lined the roads, and children searched fields for grass to eat. And yet, this was only the beginning. The chronicles of the time describe the weather as confused. They speak of a darkness that did not lift for 3 years, 1816, 1817, 1818, a slow, rolling catastrophe that smothered an entire hemisphere. In today's terms, scientists might call it a volcanic winter. In the language of that age, it was simply the wrath of heaven. The storms did not stop at Europe's edge. They crossed the Atlantic, following settlers to the New World. In New England, July mornings began with ice on the window panes. Crops failed there too. Riots erupted in Pennsylvania and New York. Whole families packed their belongings and left for the Midwest, chasing rumors of sunlight that never came. They found only more gray sky, more frost, more hunger. This was not a local misfortune. It was a global event, a wound that spanned continents. And so the question returns, if even the Americas froze, what of Russia? The empire of endless plains and cruel winters. The strange thing is, history goes silent. For Europe, we have diaries, newspapers, letters written in desperation. For America, we have sermons and town records listing the dead. But for Russia, almost nothing. A few scattered mentions of cold seasons, of poor harvests, of famine years, tucked into provincial ledgers. But no large-scale description of what happened. No memoirs, no national chronicle, no lament from the Tsar's court. As if a whole empire had turned to stone and said nothing. Some historians take this silence as proof that nothing unusual happened. But can silence itself be a sign? Not of absence, but of erasure? Imagine the scale of the disaster if it truly struck Russia, a land already cold, already vast, its people dependent almost entirely on the soil. If Europe suffered famine, Russia would have faced annihilation. 3 years without sun means 3 years without grain. Without grain, there is no bread, no feed for animals, no seed for the next harvest. Without horses, transportation collapses. Without fuel, homes freeze. And when every road vanishes under meters of snow, no help can come from anywhere. The empire becomes a graveyard of ice. Now picture the cities. St. Petersburg, Moscow, Kiev, isolated islands of stone in an ocean of white. Their lifelines, the rivers, sealed under a crust of ice so thick that spring itself could not break it. Caravans from the south never arrive. Food reserves dwindle, then vanish. The fires die one by one. The last animals disappear from the streets. And somewhere in that long, sunless twilight, the first desperate acts begin. Hunger makes people inventive at first, then cruel. Dogs and cats vanish. Birds are trapped and eaten. Flour is mixed with bark, soup boiled from leather boots. What follows next is a pattern that repeats itself in every great famine throughout history. Theft, then violence, then collapse. The strong prey on the weak. Law becomes a memory. The city becomes a beast devouring itself. No one writes about it, because the ones who might have written are dying with the rest. The young and the strong flee. They have no destination, only a way, into the forests, where there is wood for fire and perhaps a chance to hunt. The old and sick are left behind. The children, too small to travel, remain in their frozen apartments. When the snow finally buries the streets, the silence returns. The same silence we see in those photographs a few decades later. 3 years pass. And then, one day, sunlight returns. It is weaker, as if afraid to touch what remains. The snow melts, and the cities rot. The thaw reveals what the cold preserved. Thousands of bodies, whole neighborhoods filled with the dead. The air turns poisonous. Wells are contaminated. Animals, wild and feral, move into the cities, feeding on the remains. Epidemics follow, erasing the last survivors who thought the worst had passed. What's left is uninhabitable, a shell of a city filled with disease and memory. Those who survived in the forests avoid returning. They've learned that the cities have become mass graves. And then time moves on. Years pass. The forests begin to reclaim the outskirts. The wind clears the smell. Eventually, someone, perhaps an official, perhaps a new ruler, decides it's time to rebuild. They send workers, masons, engineers. They clean, repair, repaint. They replace windows and restore fountains. They make the city look new again, because the dead deserve a decent tomb, and the living need somewhere to start over. And then, as if to certify the resurrection, a photographer is sent. The task, to document what has been restored. The result, the photographs we see today. Perfect, silent, impossibly clean. But what we're seeing may not be life, it may be afterlife. A civilization's carefully staged rebirth after the Great Freeze. If this theory is true, then those photographs are not glimpses of ordinary cities. They are memorials, funerary portraits of a world reborn from catastrophe, each image a visual statement. It's over now. The streets are ready again. The past is buried. And buried with it, the truth. But the traces are still there, hidden between lines of forgotten history, in the silent ruins beneath our feet. Because every civilization that rises builds itself on the bones of the one that fell before it. In the next part, we'll dig deeper into that buried layer, into what came after the ice, the repopulation, the rewriting of memory, and the chilling possibility that an entire generation was born without a past. When the sun finally returned, it did not bring joy, it brought revelation. The cities that had slept beneath ice now lay exposed, their beauty twisted into horror. Stone monuments rose over seas of decay. Streets that once echoed with wheels and hooves were littered with what remained of a vanished civilization. And yet, amid all that ruin, something extraordinary began to happen. People came back. They came from the forests, from the villages that had endured, from the southern plains that still yielded grain. Some were the descendants of those who had fled. Others were strangers, drawn by rumors of empty houses, of forgotten treasures, of land waiting to be claimed. They came cautiously at first, stepping around skeletons and shattered glass, and when they saw that the plague had burned itself out, that the air was breathable again, they began to settle. This was not a triumphant return. It was a quiet, almost ritual reoccupation, a repopulation not of joy but of necessity. The first to arrive were not families but workers, strong young men sent under official orders. Their task was not to live, but to clean. They shoveled out debris, dismantled collapsed roofs, dragged away the dead. Then came the builders and the engineers, charged with restoring what had once been great. They laid new bricks, painted new facades, and replaced broken glass. Slowly, like flesh growing over bone, the cities began to look whole again. But something was missing. The people who returned were not the same people who had left. They were younger, harder, strangers to the streets they now claimed. The old order, nobles, scholars, artisans, priests, had been wiped away. Those who remained had no memory of how things used to be. To them, the grand boulevards and Baroque palaces were not homecoming sites. They were mysteries, relics from a world they had never known. And so a strange kind of civilization began to form, a society living inside the architecture of ghosts. They inhabited homes built by people whose names they did not know, cooked in kitchens they did not design, slept beneath ceilings painted with symbols they could not read. The cathedrals stood, but the faith that had built them was gone. The library survived, but no one remembered the language of their books. The new inhabitants of the old cities lived surrounded by history, yet cut off from it entirely. The catastrophe had not just killed people, it had severed memory itself. Imagine growing up in a city like that. You play in the shadow of marble statues, but no one can tell you whom they represent. You walk on streets with names whose origins are lost. You enter buildings that feel older than time itself, but every adult insists they were built recently, perhaps only decades ago. History becomes fluid, malleable, something that can be rewritten at will, and someone did rewrite it. Governments, or what remained of them, soon realized the opportunity. With the past buried under snow and silence, they could tell any story they wished. They could invent origins, heroes, dynasties. They could say the new world was built from nothing, that its rulers were the first to bring civilization, and no one could prove otherwise. The children of the catastrophe became the citizens of a manufactured history. They were told that their cities had always been theirs, that they were pioneers, not inheritors, that the great stone palaces had been built recently by wise emperors, not rediscovered after a dark age. And so began the Great Forgetting. There's a Russian phrase that survives to this day: Ivan, who does not remember his kinship. It's usually an insult, meaning a man without roots, without loyalty. But maybe, just maybe, it began as a literal description. An entire generation of orphans, raised in cities without parents or grandparents to tell them who they were. A generation that had survived the ice, but not the memory of what came before it. Think about that for a moment. What would it mean to grow up in a civilization that has lost its past? Every tradition, every craft, every story erased. Every house rebuilt, but hollow of meaning. You could teach these people anything, shape them however you wanted. You could give them a new religion, a new history, a new purpose. They would believe you because they had nothing left to compare it to. And so the 19th century, as we know it, may not have been the beginning of modern civilization, but its reboot. The visible record of a world rebuilt atop the ashes of another, This theory might sound impossible until you look at how perfectly the pieces fit. Why do so many great cities share the same architecture, as if built from one blueprint? Why do we find neoclassical facades and similar city layouts across continents, from Paris to St. Petersburg, from London to New York, all appearing within the same few decades? Officially, we call it style, the spread of taste, of technology, of progress. But what if it was something else? A reconstruction effort? A coordinated reoccupation of the world after the dark century had passed. Those architectural twins might not be evidence of shared fashion, but of shared memory loss. This, then, was the second birth of humanity's cities, the era of restoration disguised as innovation, the century when we rebuilt what we had forgotten we'd lost. The photographs that began this story capture that strange in-between moment, the pause between ruin and return, between the dead world and the living one. The streets were ready, the fountains flowing, the chimneys repaired, but the people were still waiting to be brought back, to be written back into the world. If the theory holds true, then the empty photographs are not accidents of long exposure or artistic choice, they are deliberate records. Proof for those in power that the great experiment of rebuilding civilization could begin anew. And yet, behind the polished facades and fresh plaster, the truth remained sealed in cellars, buried in crypts, hidden beneath the floors of those same buildings. Proof that the cities we think we built were in fact inherited. Civilization was not born in the 19th century, it was resurrected. But resurrection comes at a price, and that price was memory. In the next part, we'll follow that loss of memory to its final consequence. How the rewriting of history shaped the modern world we live in today, and how the photographs that started this mystery may be the only surviving witnesses of the truth. The world that rose from the ice was not the same one that had frozen. It looked familiar. The streets, the buildings, the flags. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had changed. Humanity had not merely rebuilt its cities, it had rebuilt its memory. What had once been history was now myth. The new rulers of this reborn world faced a choice. They could tell the truth, that civilization had nearly vanished, that famine and cold had reduced humanity to its barest instincts, or they could bury it. They chose to bury it, because to admit the truth would be to admit fragility, that the mighty empires of men were as mortal as the people who built them. That all our monuments, our libraries, our proud philosophies could be erased by a single shift of the earth, a single winter without sun. So they wrote a new story. They called it progress. In this new history, the 19th century became an age of invention, of enlightenment, of industry. The empty years were rewritten as years of triumph. The blank in memory became a dawn. Steam engines, factories, railroads, all presented as symbols of humanity's unstoppable rise, not as the frantic rebuilding of a species recovering from near extinction. And the people, the orphans of the ice, believed it. How could they not? They had no living elders to contradict the story. No records left from the lost world. The libraries had burned. The languages had shifted. Even the very maps of the old world had been redrawn. They were told that they were the first to conquer nature, the first to build great cities, the first to stand upon the shoulders of giants who, in truth, no longer existed. They were told that everything before them had been primitive, dark, barbaric. And perhaps that was easier to believe than the alternative, that they were merely survivors wandering through the ruins of a forgotten golden age. When you look at those old photographs now, the clean streets, the silent facades, the perfect emptiness, you're not just seeing the aftermath of disaster, you're seeing the birth of a new narrative, a world carefully staged to look uninterrupted, as if history had never skipped a beat. But look closely, and you can still see the seams. In the uncanny symmetry of architecture that appears too uniform to be coincidence. In the absence of records that should exist but don't. In the mysterious gaps in population statistics, where millions simply vanish between censuses. In the language shifts that happen too fast, too completely. These are the fingerprints of the great forgetting. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling truth of all. Not that a catastrophe happened, but that someone worked so hard to make us forget it did. Because forgetting is control. If you can erase the past, you can invent the future. If no one remembers what was lost, then whatever you build becomes the only reality that ever was. It's possible that the great 19th century Renaissance, The art, the architecture, the science was not a beginning, but a cover-up. A cultural reconstruction designed to fill the void left by silence. And those haunting photographs? They are the cracks in that illusion, the unintentional confessions of a world that tried to hide its own rebirth. They are the last witnesses of an event no one was meant to remember. Look at them again. Really look. The empty streets, the immaculate stone, the lifeless windows staring back at you. They are not lifeless by accident. They are lifeless by design. Each one is a silent message from a time before our time. This happened. The world died once, and when it woke again, it remembered nothing. Maybe that's why those images still unsettle us today. Somewhere deep inside, a part of us recognizes the truth, that we too are living on the surface of something buried, that the world we call modern might simply be the latest layer of a much older one. And perhaps that's why we're drawn to these mysteries, to the ghosts in glass and stone, to the ruins beneath our cities, because some part of humanity still remembers, even if our history books do not. So the next time you walk through an old European street, admire its architecture, its impossible perfection. Pause. Listen. Beneath your feet, beneath the bricks and the polished stone, lies another world. A world erased. A civilization that lived, died, and was forgotten so completely that only the empty photographs remain to prove it ever existed. And yet, here we are, asking questions again, looking, wondering, refusing to forget. Maybe that's how memory begins. Not with certainty, but with curiosity, with one person daring to ask, what really happened? Because history may belong to those who write it, but truth belongs to those who keep searching. If you've made it this far, thank you. If this story made you think, if it stirred something in you, don't let it fade into the noise of the algorithm. Share it. Leave your thoughts below. Tell me what you believe happened to the cities of the 19th century. And if you want to keep exploring the forgotten corners of our world, the buried histories, the unexplained photographs, the mysteries time tried to erase, make sure to subscribe, because somewhere out there, another silent witness is waiting to be found, and the next story might change how you see the world forever.